podcast. My name is And. Yes, I am here with Winnie Tam Hung, a wonderful contest winner. If you hear a little bit of muffling, it's because we both got masks on because we're being safe. If you're out there, make sure you're being safe. And Winnie, say hello to the wonderful people.
Hello, wonderful people. I'm so happy to be here.
And you were one of our 4 contest winners. And what's interesting is that I had a lot of people submit who I know. And typically, whenever I mention poetry, I tend to know a lot of the scenes, so I'm very used to seeing some faces and some names. I had no idea who you were before. And I'm wondering, we already talked about it a little bit, but if you could just talk about, like, how did you get into poetry? How long have you been writing?
I've been writing on and off since I was a kid, I guess. That's probably similar to a lot of other poets. And I don't actually consider myself a poet. My day job is I'm a lecturer at Sac State in ethnic studies, and I teach Asian American studies. And I think poetry is how I first started talking about my experiences as an Asian American woman, as a mother. And so this poem really emerged out of those experiences and the outrage, the fear, the grief that we're still kind of moving through, swimming in. That's really where this poem comes from.
Yeah, and there's so much to be said on it that really, I feel at least, and I obviously can't speak for everyone, I don't feel like it even gets talked about hardly at all, if ever. Like, I'm personally Cuban American, Mexican American. You hear my story every now and then. Not so much on the Cuban side. With Black America, we hear the story a lot, unfortunately, about how all the mistreatment and such. As an Asian American woman, do you feel like your story is being told at all?
I feel like my story gets packaged in movies about war, where I see women who look like me die for white men, or we get saved by white men, or we get hypersexualized for the white male gaze. And then we also are the butts of jokes about massage parlors and nail salons and things like that. So it's not my story. It's not the story of folks like me. It's not anybody's story. It's a fantasy that comes out of war and imperialism.
100%. And as a kid growing up, did you find yourself looking to these media sources, or did you have other avenues that you looked to mainly?
I think luckily, because I come from an immigrant family, so we consumed a lot of ethnic media, where there were actors and actresses who looked like me, sound like me, and spoke my native language, and, lived 3-dimensional lives.
Yeah.
So I'm sure it's very different for folks like my kids who, don't have access to ethnic media because they don't speak the language. And so for them, I really worry about the images that they are internalizing and the kind of power dynamics.
Yeah. And as a parent, how do you navigate that, even like with so limited options?
I think luckily some of that scene is changing. Even in the mainstream kind of blockbuster movies, we do see some more increased representation. But at the same time, there's a lot of history to kind of unlearn. And there's a lot of internalized desire for whiteness. Because, whiteness is a privilege. And so proximity to whiteness has also given light-skinned Asian Americans like myself some privilege as well. And so there's a lot of unlearning and decolonizing to do.
Yeah, I mean, and you look at the history of Hollywood, even hiring white actors to portray Asian characters in some ways that, like, I didn't realize until a few years ago when I was looking back, even like Star Trek, back in the old Star Trek days, how they handled white actors making their eyes look
with the
quote
tape.
unquote Asian with the tape,
right.
And just on that regard, and still there's a little bit of that today even going on, and it's always shocking to me whenever I see it. Because it's so easy to think that we've moved forward and progressed so much as a society. How much do you feel we've actually changed?
I think it's clear. This pandemic has made it unbearably, devastatingly clear that we haven't gotten far at all. There are folks out in Placerville who protested the removal of the noose from their official logo.
Blew my mind.
So, I mean, we haven't gotten anywhere, I think. We've just gotten better at hiding it. And I think the past 4 years that we've lived through has really we've lost the veneer of that politeness.
Yeah.
And so it's like racism without the gloves now.
Yeah, and I should point out, I forgot to point this out at the very start. You are a professor over at Sac State for
ethnic studies and Asian American studies.
Perfect. How long have you been teaching for?
I've been teaching on and off for the past 10 years, but I started at Sac State about 3 years ago.
Oh wow, right on. So I've always been curious, like going into that. What drew you towards that study and towards this avenue of teaching?
I think the fact that I'm from the East Coast originally, and so there isn't much in the way of ethnic studies out there. There's some people, but when I came to California and I found this vocabulary, this language, I think that's really what drew me to it, because it's so powerful. It's so community-based and rooted in kind of shared oppression and solidarity with other BIPOC folks. So I feel like I learned this powerful language that I hadn't been exposed to as a kid.
Yeah. Where on the East Coast did you live? I lived in New Hampshire for a little bit myself.
Oh, I'm originally from Queens, New York.
Oh, no joke.
Yeah.
What's Queens like? Like I got to visit New York for like a week as a kid, but I feel like there's no way you can capture New York in a week.
I can't even answer that, because even as a native New Yorker, it's, you go from one block to the next and it's a completely different demographic. It's a different language, food scene. It's a different pedestrian scene. It's always kind of changing. Yeah.
That blows my mind. Like, the way I feel about New York is kind of like if you took Sacramento and you just squished it all together. That's how I always get the impression. Because we're one of the most diverse cities in America. But I've noticed more and more over the years that we are deeply separated. Like there are entire pockets of people, kind of in the same way that you have the boroughs out in New York. But we're deeply separated to the point where you could be driving through Sacramento, and I was just talking to someone about this actually, and you could come across somewhere that looks completely different from anywhere else in the city, which is wonderful. But do you feel like there's any mixing of cultures that's actually happening, or do we segregate ourselves so much?
I think it might be... I mean, it's related as well to kind of class privilege. I live in Elk Grove, which is diverse, and my children's school is very diverse. I'm very grateful for that. Yeah. But at the same time, we get our groceries and food from South Sac. And then you can drive, we used to live in the Pocket area, but right next to that is Meadowview. And, so you just go through all these different parts. And I think that what you can see most clearly is not necessarily kind of a racial breakdown, but a class breakdown along those kind of geographic barriers.
Yeah. And to jump completely to a different subject, I noticed in your poem, there's more than just the story of the problems of society getting to you. There's also this element of self-ownership and self-acceptance. You talk about the marks on your body that you learn to love and accept. And how long did it take you to get to that point?
40 years, probably. I would say a good 30, 38, 39 years. Yeah. Definitely.
Wow. Yeah. And so if you're out there, don't lose hope. I know I'm 33 and I'm still trying to get all of that situated. Some days waking up in the morning, it could be a little bit tough. What's part of your ritual for just maintaining that?
Journaling, writing, and unplugging when I can. That's rough though. That's hard to do for me. And also not just from social media, but sometimes from the news as well, because there's so much. Every day there's a new incident. Every day there's a shooting. There's a mass shooting, and that really re-traumatizes people who read it and people who consume it, because it's so visceral. Yeah. It's so real.
Yeah. And it's odd to me how the mass shootings and all of this stuff still has continued even in the middle of the pandemic, where you would think we'd be mostly shut in. There wouldn't be as much opportunity for this to happen. And I wonder how much that says about, I don't know, just our level of acceptable violence in our society. But that's a whole other diatribe.
I think we've learned to live with a lot.
Yeah.
We've learned to live with a lot and get over a lot of things quickly because there's always a new incident of violence.
Yeah. And in reading your poem, on the level of self-acceptance and all of the different themes that you're able to discuss, it left me wondering, is that the style of poem that you always write, or what do you typically write about?
Funnily enough, that's how I always start my academic papers.
Oh, with a poem?
With kind of a free write,
Oh, wow.
you know, and just kind of I've been learning to include the way I feel
Mhm.
in the way that I teach and in the way that I write academically. And I think that part of that self-ownership that comes through in the poem stems from my learning to own my story, my learning to own my truth. And that's floofy, but my truth doesn't get taught in K to 12. My truth doesn't get taught, my community story doesn't get taught in our formal learning because it's not European.
Yeah. And it's beautiful that you're able to get that out there. I love all the different aspects and ways that people come into poetry. For me, I started off as an 11-year-old writing about major depression, and my brother came in with a bunch of books, and he said, "This is what you're doing," and he just handed me a bunch of books.
Wow.
And I went like, "Oh, okay, cool." He wanted me to read like Shakespeare and all this, and I went, "Cool," and I just kind of put it in the corner because I was terrible at doing homework as a kid. But so for me, I've had like I guess my exposure to poetry initially wasn't that great, and I was wondering if you could speak on poetry as you were exposed to it as a kid and educated on it as a kid. Because, like, for me, for instance, going a little bit more into it, in high school, when they would tell us to read Romeo and Juliet, for instance,
oh yeah,
it was a monotone reading with just a teacher who would popcorn to kids, and kids didn't know how to read Old English. And I was wondering, so like along those lines, like, what was your early childhood exposure to poetry?
I got tracked from a young age into one of those gifted and talented, kind of programs in school, public school. And so my exposure to poetry, I think, was similar to yours, where we did plays and because we were in New York, we were able to go see certain shows or bring certain folks to the school. So I was very lucky to get exposure in that way. But at the same time, it was kind of this old, traditional, canonical poetry in terms of what was accepted. And so the voices that I learned about, was nothing that felt relevant or reflective of what I went through or what my family went through as immigrants. And so I feel like I didn't really discover the power of poetry and imagery until I got to college and was introduced to slam poetry.
Oh, yeah.
So, I kind of found deaf poetry jams, and one of my favorite slam poets is Suhair Hamad.
Okay, yeah.
And her, her voice in talking about her homeland and her struggles and, her communities and the pain of being separated from a place that you think of as home and not being accepted in the place that you thought was your home here. I think that really opened something up in me.
Yeah, and how do you keep up with it nowadays? Because obviously, deaf poetry has been off the air for a while, and you're not able to go to open mics because you're parenting and such, understandably. But if you ever get the chance to make it out, we have a beautiful scene out here. If you haven't seen it before,
wow,
yeah, like Luna's Cafe. There's a whole list I could send.
Cool, yeah.
And we actually have our own slam team. Shout outs to the Sac Slam, Sac Unified Slam team. Yeah.
Ooh.
And where was I going with that? Oh, how do you keep up with your poetry nowadays?
I think, unfortunately, my poetry now sometimes can be reactionary, just kind of in response to things that are happening in the world, things that frustrate me and that I can't necessarily address in an academic setting.
Yeah.
So I think it's an outlet for me to reach the parts of myself and the things that I want to say without having to cite a bunch of folks.
Yeah. And you told me the story of how you wrote this poem before. Do you feel comfortable saying it?
Sure.
On here? Okay. Yeah.
Sure. This poem came out of an attempt to write something academic where I was asked to speak at a healing circle for API, Desi American folks on our campus. And I wanted to write something that, this isn't the final version of what I wound up saying at that event, but this is how it started. And I didn't realize I had all of these thoughts, all of these kind of feelings swirling around as I was trying to make sense of what was coming out of Atlanta and all of the attacks on Asian elders in San Francisco and, in New York, where my parents still are. So it was really very personal, but I wanted to speak to some of the history of anti-Asian violence that's rooted in the very foundations of this country.
Yeah, and when I was going through all the poems, I had 36 submissions, and I had whittled it down to 8. And I was going through the 8, and it came down to really with your poem, the fact that you were able to tell a story eloquently but simply so that people could understand exactly what was going on without beating people over the head with it. There's you just have a wonderful voice to how you wrote.
Thank you.
And I appreciate it. It's a strong voice. I really wish that you had time to come out to more open mics and stuff like that. Because I'm more than anything, when I was reading this poem, I was really curious how you were going to present it. So it's not in the podcast. It will have already been posted by the time that we go here. If you haven't heard it, make sure to go to the YouTube channel, Operation FreeSoul, to check out this wonderful poem by Winnie Tam Hung. And before we get out of here, what I'm wondering is, so how do I put this? You're a poet who hasn't really been exposed to our poetry scene. At all? Or have you ever had?
At all.
Wow. That blows my mind. So it's been a little bit since I met someone who hasn't been out to the open mics and all of that. And it speaks to me so much about how Sacramento and the Sacramento area has so many artists who are just shut into themselves. And we have all this amazing art that's waiting to come out. And I guess the way I should put it is, how do you feel like, or would you, I should say, in the first place, feel comfortable having a venue where you could present, and what would that look like to you that would fit with you?
Oh, I mean, in some ways I present all the time. I teach classes, twice a week, and I teach hundreds of students by now.
Yeah.
But it's written material that's generated by somebody else.
Yeah.
So I think for me, what a poetry space would look like would be something very intimate with people of color in the audience and folks who are kind of where I don't have to explain, where I come from or what that means. And, that experience where we just kind of meet as a gathering of minds, with trust in the space.
Yeah. And in general, outside of poetry, do you feel like you have a space like that?
I think in academia, I have found kind of this small niche in ethnic studies and in Asian American studies with people who are real, with people who kind of really put their money where their mouths are and not just provide lip service and not just make empty proclamations and condemnations, etc. I feel like I found a community of people at Sac State who do this, who provide this kind of institutional home for my mind. So I'm really grateful for that.
That's beautiful. And honestly, and I'm not just saying this because you're on the show and whatever, I really do want to read more of your work.
Thank
I really
you.
do want to hear more of it. I always tell people, when I say I want you to write more and I want to see more of your work, it's from a totally selfish point of view. I just I'm a greedy mother when it comes to art. So,
I definitely feel that.
Yeah, and I that it's a story that needs to be told more, needs to be spoken about more, by just everybody in general, but also from people who, especially from people who have experienced it. And I feel like your work could start a lot of great conversations around just making sure that we don't hurt people, I guess is the right way to put it.
Yeah.
My brain's a little bit
further
funky,
harm.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you so much for entering. Actually, I'm curious, how did you find out?
Facebook.
Facebook, really?
Facebook.
Okay. The ads do work.
I think I joined a Sacramento poetry page.
Oh, yeah.
And then I saw this announcement, and I thought, I had just written it, and I thought, why not, And
it's free to enter, and you could win $150. Like, why not?
Right.
Yeah,
and, be part of this scene that I'm not part of currently.
Yeah.
So.
And I'll be sending you a whole list of like venues and stuff.
That'd be great.
Yeah. Cool. And again, thank you so much, Winnie Tam Hung.
Thank you.
If you have Winnie as a professor, just give some extra love, like especially during the pandemic. I'm sure it's been hard to teach. And if you're not already, make sure you're taking care of yourselves. Drink your water. All right. Bye.